In the late summer of 1914, the Polish village of Tarnawka was focused on a singular, urgent task: the harvest. The fields were thick with ripe, golden rye, and the local peasant population needed to pull the crops from the earth before the season turned. But the prospect of war was quickly becoming a physical reality. Jan Zając, a local farmer, watched as Russian Cossack cavalry scouts infiltrated the dirt roads around his home. Under the guise of military maneuvers, the riders were mapping the topography, charting every nook, ravine, and highway for an impending offensive. The disruption was immediate. The Russian government issued mobilization decrees, stripping the village of its young men and its vital agricultural labor force. Days later, a low, terrifying rumble shook the ground from the southwest. Zając described it as the groan of cannons. The Austro-Hungarian First Army was approaching. The arrival of heavy artillery crashed directly into the village's agricultural rhythm. Fear overtook the workers, and the harvest ground to a halt as a season of survival turned into a period of total paralysis. Behind those approaching Austrian lines, senior military physician Dr. Bernhard Bardach arrived in Tarnawka to establish field hospitals. He found a military infrastructure already failing at basic survival. Bardach and his medical unit were quartered directly inside local farmhouses that lacked chimneys. The moment they lit fires for warmth or sterilization, the rooms filled to the ceiling with thick, blinding wood smoke. It was impossible to stand upright, let alone treat the wounded. Choking on the fumes, the doctor abandoned the farmhouse and sought shelter in a drafty, uninsulated barn. Sitting in the cold, he dryly noted in his diary that this miserable environment marked the start of his summer vacation. The offensive was stalling before it even reached the enemy. Deployed without adequate billets, field kitchens, or sanitation, the armies were physically degrading from environmental exposure and logistical neglect. On September 7th, the artillery found Tarnawka. Shells rained down on the village, and around midnight, panic erupted as thatched roofs caught fire, illuminating the valley in an erratic, terrifying glow. For civilians like Jan Zając, trapped in the crossfire of a 3-day battle, the horror was intensely auditory. He listened as the valleys echoed with the shrill screams of infantrymen fighting at close quarters, layered over the continuous groans of wounded soldiers. Down in those black valleys, German ordnance officer Bernhard Stolberg executed a desperate nighttime bayonet charge into a Russian trench. But as he jumped into the position, he realized the men behind him were gone. He was alone with a single lieutenant. Stolberg's troops were Landwehr, older, under-equipped reservists. The command plugged a massive 50-mile gap with them, expecting frontline stamina. Pushed into long-distance marches without warm rations, their bodies reached a biological limit. Under stress, their discipline dissolved, melting into darkness. The cult of the offensive doctrine failed at the point of execution. It demanded superhuman kinetic endurance from physically exhausted men who had nothing left to give. Standing abandoned in the Russian trench, Stolberg directed his anger at his own Austro-Hungarian high command. He called the generals desk scholars, men who were brilliant at mapping out abstract maneuvers in clean offices, but absent when it was time to roll up their sleeves and act in the mud. As the offensive collapsed into a retreat, this resentment shattered military discipline. In one instance, an Austrian lieutenant drew his revolver on a German wagon driver, threatening his own ally to secure priority for his baggage train. The physiological and psychological stress of the front reached past individual soldiers to break the operational alliance between the Central Powers. Under this pressure, tactical unity was replaced by armed standoffs. By September 11th, the retreat was in full motion. Dr. Bardach documented the army executing scorched earth tactics, blowing up bridges to deny the Russians useful logistics. As the armies withdrew, Jan Zając stepped out to survey his fields. What he found across the Tarnawka landscape, he wrote, was frightfully horrifying. The unharvested summer crops were gone. In their place, the corpses of soldiers were packed together like sheaves of wheat during harvest. In one plot of lupine alone, nearly 100 blood-splattered bodies lay hidden in the stalks. The earth was so heavily cratered by grenades and saturated with metallic debris, scrap lead, copper, and brass, that cultivating the soil was impossible. The landscape was no longer a resource for the living. It had been converted into a massive, iron-choked graveyard. For 6 months, the bodies lay exactly where they fell, freezing in the open air until February 1915. To prevent pestilence, the occupying Russian police conscripted the surviving peasants of Tarnawka to clean up the battlefield. The operation was overseen by an Orthodox priest, who enforced brutal discipline from his carriage. Forced to handle the thawed remains, the farmers hacked massive trenches into the frozen earth. They buried thousands of men who fought across their backyards. The maneuvers of the High Command produced a landscape of waterlogged craters and half-decayed bodies. Tarnawka left the local population to reap the empire's only tangible harvest: the dead.